Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. I'm Sandy Johnson, President Emeritus of the National Press Foundation. Today, we're helping journalists understand what happens when millions of students return to school after a year of mostly remote learning. We know that many of the littlest children lost out on a precious year of kindergarten, according to a Stanford New York Times analysis. And a new NWEA analysis shows alarming declines in reading and math, especially among minority and low-income children. We want to thank our sponsors of our Poverty and Inequality series, including today's briefing, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Heising Simons Foundation. With us today are Amanda Fernandez, CEO and founder of Latinos for Education, Ife Damon, a special education and multi-subject teacher in New York City, and also a member of Educators for Excellence, Laura Meckler, Washington Post education reporter, and Miguel Cardona, Education Secretary for the Biden administration. Welcome. We'll start with Secretary Cardona, who will be with us for 30 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to be with you today. What an important time in our country's history. We have, as you pointed out, a challenge of having students who, many of whom have been in front of a computer or a device for about a year, returning into our schoolhouses. And we're gonna get it done. And we also have an opportunity here. We also have an opportunity to reimagine what education can be and not set the goal to be what it was in March of 2020. With the unprecedented funds and support and direction from the President of the United States, I feel confident that we can reopen our schools safely, but also we can welcome students to schools that are more holistically embracing, that provide not only the academic support that our children need, but also the social and emotional well-being, better connections with families. And I'm fortunate to serve in this role at this time in our country's history. I look forward to the conversation, to the questions, and to sharing how we're planning on reopening schools.
Thank you, Secretary Cardona. We are allowing their three speakers to put a question to the Secretary first, and then we'll open it up to journalists who are registered for this event. So Amanda Fernandez, why don't you go ahead with the first question for the Secretary.
Thank you, Sandy, and good afternoon, Secretary Cardona. Nice to see you again. My question is about the issue of digital equity. And as you know, the issue of digital equity has been a major barrier for Latino children and their families in the past year and a half or so, and a major contributor to the disruption in learning. Recognizing that internet access and broadband access need to become commonplace in our education system, how are you thinking about accelerating access? And I think in particular, given that the infrastructure bill has about $65 billion in broadband investments, what will that look like for our low-income children and families?
Thank you for the question, Amanda, and it's nice to see you again as well. Thank you for the work you're doing. You know, you mentioned over the last year and a half, our students, particularly Black and Brown students and students in rural areas, have had significant disruption due to the lack of broadband. But I would argue that before the pandemic, the gaps were there as well. We were just not attuned to it as a country. The pandemic exacerbated those gaps. It brought them out where everyone can see them. And I would say that not only is the divide greater for some students, but so was access to high quality curriculum online when they did get online, access to meals, access to other issues that are of extreme importance. So we learned that the pandemic brought out those issues and exacerbated them. The digital divide, I would argue, was the most visible. I recall, Amanda, when I was in Connecticut as Commissioner of Education, 4 weeks into my role, 4 weeks into the shutdown of our physical buildings. You know, school was still going on, but it was now remote. I remember having a conversation, so it was about mid-April, with two superintendents, one of a very affluent district, and I asked him, I said, how's it going? You know, how are you doing? How are the kids doing? And he said, you know what, Miguel? Thankfully, our kids have devices. They all have good internet access. And we have good curricular tools that are online already that our district has invested in for many years. So all the tools that the teachers need to provide high quality instruction are there. Again, all one-to-one devices, and many of our students are fortunate to have a parent working from home, at least one parent. Some students have two parents working from home. So I knew, basically what he said was, all we had to do is turn the switch on and we're good. Then I talked to a superintendent in a very resource deprived district, right? Struggling with some of the basics. And that superintendent told me, 4 weeks have passed and we still haven't communicated with many of our families, those who are in greatest need. So now, when you think about the first district and this district, think about the gaps, how much greater they were 4 weeks later. The digital divide exacerbated that. With the infrastructure bill and with the funds and the focus on infrastructure, I'm hopeful that we can put the digital divide behind us. That, I often say the device this is the new pencil. This is the new pencil. And we need to think that way as educators now, that this is no longer a luxury for families and for students. This is now the method of communication, the currency of information exchange. And we have to look at providing broadband access and quality devices as important as it is to provide a student with a pencil. So with the infrastructure plan, but equally as important with the focus of the president and the administration to make sure we're thinking about infrastructure the way we are and thinking about education the way we are, I'm confident that the digital divide can be behind us and we can really focus on the quality of content that our students are getting through their devices. So we do recognize in Connecticut, one of the first things we did was provide technology and access to students across the state. That was one of the first things we focused on. And I'm sure throughout the country, that is a priority and we're going to get it done.
And our next question is from Ife Damon, a New York City teacher.
Hi, Ife.
Hi, good afternoon, Secretary Cardona. Very nice to meet you. Like you, I was born into educational marginalization and have witnessed the impact the opportunity gap that you're speaking of has had on many peers and relatives as a result of the disconnect between instructional approaches and learners' needs. With the pandemic presenting a new threat to equity that you just talked about by widening this gap even further, my question for you is, what systems of accountability and support are in place to ensure that the American Rescue Plan funds actually trickle down into the classrooms and students who need it the most?
Well, first of all, thank you for your service and your call to be an educator and in New York City. So thank you for being there and for the work you're doing, the work you've done to serve our students. You're absolutely right. There's a tremendous amount of support, and I'm a big believer in equal parts support and accountability. And what we're doing now is, taking the unprecedented funds of the American Rescue Plan, $130 billion for schools to address inequities in education, to address the systemic failures in some places, to make sure that students who are in great need get the support that they need. The way it was written in Congress was that the funds were going to be distributed 2/3. So we already distributed $81 billion. And what we're doing now is the last third. We're reviewing state plans in order to get that last third. So we've approved about 22 plans, partly because we want to make sure that these districts, these states are focusing on equity and stakeholder engagement. Now, there weren't, connected to the American Rescue Plan, there weren't a lot of requirements that came through. Congress really wanted the money to get out there, and I understand that people were in need to get the school safe, but what we're doing is working closely by calling governors, state chiefs, superintendents. We have outreach calls multiple times a week, boards of education. Like between now and Friday, I'm gonna have calls with superintendents, boards of education, educator groups to make sure that we're communicating what the expectations are with regard to getting our students in safely, number one. Number two, making sure the social emotional well-being is being cared for. And number three, accelerating the academic improvement or the academic outcomes for students, given that they've missed instruction. We are communicating regularly, and in places, and there are places that are withholding funds or using them for other things. We're on that. We're meeting with them regularly, and we're making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing with the funds. We're also making sure that we're talking about maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity to make sure that the state funds that should be earmarked for education doesn't go down because the federal government is putting in now. It should be in addition to. Our kids need more, not less. So our ears are to the ground. We have staff working closely with our states, and we're trying to partner with them. I think everyone agrees we have to address these gaps boldly. And we're just ensuring that the funds that the federal government is putting out there is being used for what it's intended to be used. And we're intervening where we feel it's not.
A reminder to journalists who are registered for this event to raise your hand or put your question into Q&A. And we have a question now from Laura Meckler from the Washington Post.
Hello, Mr. Secretary. Nice to see you.
Hi.
Hello. My question is about primarily about summer school. The department made a big push towards summer school, really encouraged districts to use that time and, of course, that money to mitigate some of the damage that the pandemic had done. I get a sense from talking to districts it's been a little bit mixed in terms of how robust those programs turned out to be. I'm wondering if you or the department has a handle on that, like as in terms of like how successful summer was at addressing these issues. And even after the summer, I'm wondering how significant you think the gaps and the deficits are going to be academically headed into the fall.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Laura. You know, I had the privilege of visiting about 17 different states, and a lot of those visits were focused on the summer programming. And I was able to see firsthand some of these programs, what they looked like. I remember being in Oregon and seeing a summer program that was double the size it was ever the year before and any other time because of the American Rescue Plan, where students were engaging with one another and learning language in that summer program. I was in Pennsylvania yesterday and I saw a summer program that had like 2 or 3 different sessions where typically they might have a 3-week session. Well, they were running like their second or third cycle of that. To get more students in. And then I recall visiting a program where we had it was in Camden, New Jersey, where we saw the YMCA and the Boys and Girls Club pitching in. So we know that our teachers work really hard, bent over backwards. So a lot of districts, what they had to do is in order to get enough staff involved, they engage our community partners to make sure that they're a part of the program as well. So I've seen a lot of creative thinking. What I've seen that I really liked, Laura, was I didn't see one ditto anywhere I went. And I challenged teachers, and I see Iffy smiling over here. We challenge teachers, let's make this a ditto-free summer where we get kids engaging, being outdoors and doing things that we don't typically do. So I saw better programming. And I know there was a focus in the beginning to continue to summer learning and get students engaged with one another so they feel more comfortable coming into the fall. I've been pleased with what I've seen. I know that in some places they had some staffing needs because teachers rightfully so needed a moment to pause and exhale and breathe and take care of themselves and their families as well. But I think by and large across the country, we saw some innovative programming over the summer.
And Mr. Secretary, Amy Sherman from PolitiFact has a question for you. Maybe we can't get her on here, so I will ask it for her. Schools regularly require children to get multiple vaccines unless they meet the requirement of an exemption. Why is it the COVID vaccine has not been added to that list?
You know, that's a good question. And I always make it very clear that when it comes to education, I want to make sure our educators are the ones making decisions. And the same is true for me, right? I have my opinions and my thoughts. I've gotten my vaccine, my children got their vaccine as soon as, but I'm going to let the health experts determine when it's appropriate to say this is something that can be mandated. I would like to see that as long as it's safe. And I'm expecting, Amy, that, as the FDA finishes their process, it could be that after that, that conversation might come up a little bit more in earnest. But I know that vaccination is the best way to get our schools safely reopened. I mean, look at the data across the country. In places where the vaccination rates are lower, we're seeing more hospitalizations. In places where the vaccination rate is higher, we're seeing much less hospitalizations and a return to what we consider normal quicker. So vaccinations for me is the best tool we have. We're asking and partnering with our states to set up pop-up clinics in our schools to get our youth vaccinated, ages 12 to 18. We're finding that those numbers are not as high as we want them to be. So we want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to get our youth vaccinated, to get those numbers up. But eventually, if it becomes mandatory, I think that will help flatten the curve, but also get us back to normal.
And building on that, a question from Jessica Capaflati from Politico. Do you support vaccine mandates for school staff, given the growing support for mandates among cities and teachers' unions?
You know, at the end of the day, if they're safe, I do. But that's not my decision to make. If they're safe, I do. We need to get our schools reopened, and we need to make sure that we don't ever jeopardize or minimize or get in the way of everything we can do to make sure our students have an in-person learning experience. Now, I recognize that there's some folks might be, advised not to get it by their doctors. You know, there's always exceptions, but at the end of the day, if we know this is safe and we know this is going to get our students safely back in school and we can get our educational institutions up and running with the vaccine, I would support it.
And a question on masking from Amy Sherman again. Is the Biden administration considering challenging any orders by governors who have banned or limited the use of masks in school? And if so,
Yes.
when could we expect that?
Yes, for me, this is about putting students in harm's way. If we're making poor decisions that we know go against science, we're putting our students and our staff in danger. And we have a responsibility to make sure that we're doing everything to protect our students and our staff when we talk about reopening schools. And it's unfortunate that school leaders are having their hands tied behind their back by poor policy that is politically driven. So, last time I checked, there hasn't been an epidemiology course in leadership and political sci or even education leadership for that matter. Let's let the epidemiologists make decisions around what's best to keep our students safe. And let's have our educational leaders do what they know to do to keep our schools safe. It should be that way. And yes, where we're seeing that there's resistance, we are going to do everything we can to make sure we're promoting a safe return to school.
And we have a question from Jamila Bay from BET Online. Her question is about variations in kids' experiences in individual grades. She asks, in one class, you may have students who have had tutors or pod learning to accelerate their learning, sitting next to students who may have had little more than TV and social media. How do we evaluate outcomes when such disparities exist?
It was important and that's a great question. It was important that we stayed firm. And even though there was a lot of opposition to this around making sure that we're assessing where our children are, it's hard to fix a problem if we can't see how bad it is. Or when we're talking about the distribution of billions of dollars, we need to know which students were impacted the most. So what we've done is we've asked districts to make sure that they do everything in their power to assess where the children are, what they've lost, so that the resources can be proportionally applied to those students that have greater need. We were all impacted by the pandemic, all of us, some more than others. And it's really important, as the president said, that we're utilizing our funds to make sure that those who were impacted the most get the support that they need. Remember, education is that great equalizer. So we need to apply our support and resources to those who are hit hardest by making sure that we know what impact they had, not only academically, and I think that's an important point. We have to focus on the academic, but as you know, many students in our Black and Brown communities dealt with the pandemic much worse. There was greater loss of life. There was greater significant illness. So many of these students are coming in with more trauma than other students. And we have to make sure that we're not only providing the academic support, but also assessing where they are, right? Assessing where they are socially and emotionally, where their mental health needs are. And then one last mention, I was in Kansas on Monday, and I spoke to a superintendent there who had a screening tool to see where her children were on the social emotional scale, right? To see how they were impacted. And they're using those tools to assess which students need a little bit more support or which students experience really bad effects of COVID, either through losing someone in their family or having someone in their family experience a job loss. So I think if we come into our school knowing that we have good screeners for academic issues or academic loss, but also the social emotional piece, I think our students are going to be good.
And here's a question from Naomi Martin from the Boston Globe. What do you see as the role of remote learning this school year if there are outbreaks in schools? Should districts be making contingency plans that include remote learning in case they have to temporarily close classrooms?
Well, I believe remote learning has a place in education moving forward, period. I think, students learn best when we can try different approaches, different modes to learning, right? Blended learning, which is what it's called when you have different approaches to learning, whether it's in person or remote, online, anywhere, anytime learning. That's something that in education we've been tinkering with for many, many years, and it was accelerated with this. We know a combination can work. But post-pandemic, I really want to see students in the classrooms to make those personal connections because, we talk a lot about the digital divide, but we really need to address the relational divide that was exacerbated during the pandemic. So getting students in school is important. Now, if this Delta variant or another variant in the future causes that we have to go in the other direction to make sure that our students are learning but not in the schoolhouse, remote learning must be a part of it. And I know that our educators and our education leaders across the country are much better today than they were a year ago in being prepared to do that. Unfortunately, we had to learn by doing last year. And I would anticipate that this year there's contingency planning. It's very unfortunate. I'm going to double down on what I said earlier. It's very unfortunate of the stories that I'm hearing in places like Florida, where they're already having to pull out those plans because students are being quarantined or sent home, or because schools don't have the staff that they need. It's unacceptable that we're talking about doing that now when we know what works to keep our children safe. We know the mitigation strategies work. So it should be a backup plan, but it should be a backup when you tried all the mitigation strategies that can work to keep the students in school. That's critically important.
We have a question from Paul Baskin, who is from Times Higher Education. So this is about colleges. He says or asks, it appears that colleges are conceding that more and more courses will remain online this fall, given the spreading variants and low rates of vaccinations. At the same time, some universities are pushing back. What's your take on the college situation?
I applaud the educators and the educational leaders over there who are thinking, how do we keep our students engaged? And in many cases, college students are parents also. They have their own children and they're dealing with a lot of different things. So the flexibility of the colleges is critical. But I do appreciate it when those colleges take a stand and say, we're going to require vaccines here because we know it's safe and we want our school community to come back. Colleges have been hit hard as well. And the efforts to get those students back in, I was with a community college president yesterday, and he was telling me he lost a lot of students. So now they're focusing on getting those students back, connected with the college. And in many cases, the best way to do that is to offer online courses. But the goal is to have those students back on campus to learn in that learning environment that we know is so rich and to take advantages of the opportunities that the colleges offer. I applaud the colleges that are working hard and thinking creatively to keep the students engaged, but also making sure that their campuses are safe for in-person learning.
And a follow-up that actually applies to colleges and K through 12. Does something more need to be done to protect faculty who don't want to teach in person out of fear for their own health or their families?
Yeah, the health and safety of our employees is critically important. Even at the federal level, at the Department of Education, as we're talking about reopening, we want to make sure that folks feel comfortable coming in and they feel safe. And that also means acknowledging and respecting the fact that we all experience this pandemic differently. There are some people who are traumatized by loss in their families, and we have to recognize where they are emotionally as well. With that said, we know the mitigation strategies work. We know what to do to keep our students and staff safe, and we have the responsibility not only to make sure our campuses are doing that, but also to provide the service that our students need. So I believe it's critically important that we work with our staff, but we also keep in mind that we're serving students and we have to make sure that we're doing what we can to get our students back into the classroom safely. It can be done. We've seen examples where it works really well. We need to replicate those practices and recognize that, it may be, unfortunately, with what I'm seeing across the country, it may be a little bit longer until we get rid of this pandemic for good, but that doesn't mean that we have to stop learning and stop engaging in in-person learning. We just have to do it safely.
All right, and here's a question from Rebecca Catalanello from Pointer. Parsing your answer from earlier, you said you would support mandated vaccines for school employees, quote, if it's safe. What do you mean by that? And will it make a difference if the FDA approves the vaccines?
That's what I meant by that. If it's safe, meaning my wife works in a school, my children go to school daily, they both got the vaccine. So clearly for me, yes, it's something that I would want. And if the vaccines are safe, then yes, and they are safe. They're proven to be safe. I was hoping, that the FDA, stamp would happen already, but I respect that process and I understand they're doing what they have to do to ensure safety and make sure that there's confidence around it. So yes, I would. I always say if it's safe because it's really important for me to signal that we're not doing anything haphazardly. We're making sure that they're safe for our staff. It's proven to be safe. I wouldn't have gotten the vaccine or had my children get it if I questioned whether or not it was safe. I think across the country the data is proving that it's safe. So yes, I would favor the vaccine being required. But again, I think having the FDA do the final approval on it would make others make some who don't feel comfortable knowing that it was finally approved.
And a question again from Jessica Calafati from Politico. And this will be our last question from the journalist in respect of Secretary Cardona's time. Secretary, have you or someone else in the Biden administration spoken directly with Governors DeSantis and Abbott about their policies banning mask mandates? If so, what was the conversation?
Thanks for asking. Yes, I've been speaking, I think 7 or 8 governors over the last 2 weeks, and they've been great about partnering with the Department of Education to meet the president's challenge of the week of action to give pop-up vaccination clinics in their facilities. I spoke to Governor Abbott, and he recognizes the importance of vaccinations. I did share my concerns about the policies that are not in alignment with CDC and the importance of making sure that our schools are safe for our students, and also recognizing that for many communities that were hit hard by the pandemic, there's a lack of confidence in sending their children to school because of the policies, not because of COVID-19, but because of the policies, and that we're going to be monitoring that. Yeah, I called in Florida, and we were asked to speak to the Secretary of Education there, Richard Corcoran, which I did. And again, it was a pleasant conversation talking about how we need to work together to make sure our children are safe. Again, I disagree with the policies that they have. I don't think the data is proving that it's more likely to spread in those communities there. So we're going to continue to have conversations. And again, we're also going to be monitoring to make sure that the students that were hit hardest or the families that were hit hardest are not staying home because of the policies. If that's the case, I'd be very concerned about the inequities that are going to be exacerbated in those places, not because of COVID-19, but because of the policies they're putting forward.
Thank you, Secretary Cardona, for your time today.
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for the work you do. It's critically important that we have journalists sharing information, and that we support the work that you do. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I wish you the best. Take care.
We'll start with Ife. You point out the pandemic presents a new threat to equity. Please share what you mean by that.
So yes, as Secretary Cardona just stated, marginalization has been a part of American education since American education has begun. And for students who continue to be marginalized, that opportunity gap has widened even further as a result of things that Secretary Cardona mentioned, such as a lack of resources, technological resources. I had students personally who had either just didn't have any devices at all, or if they did have a device, some of them had to share it with siblings. And so oftentimes they couldn't join in on class because they had to let their younger sibling use the device. For some students, because our school in New York City did do a really, as much as they could to provide devices to every student. And even within my school, they provide hotspot devices to give to some students, but those resources were still limited. And so many students still did not have a real strong opportunity. If they didn't have Wi-Fi at home, even if they did have a device, they still could not properly participate in the learning process. And so as a result, and of course, these are the students who, like I said, have been marginalized due to race, due to ability, socioeconomic status, et cetera. And so because of that, those gaps widened even further. And so, as educators, we really do need to be creative. I hope that schools will be creative with their instructional approaches this upcoming school year, because the gaps are so wide that we can't just use our traditional approaches that we already know haven't worked for many students and just hope that they're going to magically just work just because we're back from a quarantine. But we need to be creative and think about ideas that will engage students as we continue to support them. And so, for example, for myself, like I've used community-based learning projects. I think that projects that use standards in a way to address and examine real-time issues are some of the most beneficial ways to help students become re-engaged into the learning process. And so, for example, at the beginning of last school year, we began with a time capsule project that allows students to use reading and writing, listening and speaking skills to analyze the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the Black Lives Matter pandemic. And so it was very engaging for students. It still allowed them to interact with the standards, but it wasn't just having them read Shakespeare or something that is, has already been shown to traditionally actually demotivate marginalized students.
Laura, what does student testing and evaluation tell us so far?
It tells us so far that we have big learning losses compared to what we would expect in terms of typical advancement through reading and math skills. We got a lot of that data started coming out last fall when the results from student assessments were recorded, which was essentially measuring the impact of the shutdown in spring 2020. And we've had more data coming out since, and we're going to have even more information this fall when kids get back and they start doing these assessments. So we'll have information that will tell us a lot more about how significant they are. I mean, there are some people who feel like this talk about learning loss has been overblown. Other people think it truly is a crisis. So we're going to just see more about what the numbers say. Both nationally, there are people who measure groups that measure this nationally by looking at aggregate test scores across many districts. And also for people who are covering individual school districts, you should be able to get that data for your district as well.
Yeah, and Amanda and Ife, I'm curious about your thoughts on testing and evaluation and what we've learned from those.
Well, I'll just say that I do agree that we do need to assess students. I think we always need to assess students at the beginning of the year. However, I do think that we need to really focus on what learning is most important to focus on, because, there's a lot of expectation of students that for needs that honestly don't prepare them for an evolving 21st century. And so I think that this is a great time for education as a whole to really reevaluate what are the skills that are actually most important that students need to be able to survive and to be able to compete and use those 21st century skills in order to be better prepared as independent citizens. So I do, think that there will be learning loss, but also at the same time, I do wonder what we're looking at when we're measuring and deciding what loss actually is.
Yeah, I would add that I am in support as well as some level of assessment, in particular, the ways in which assessment in a lot of states was adapted in order to assess learning loss. At the same time, I also agree that we have to look at adapting our ways for accountability and measurement moving forward because of the impact of the pandemic, in particular on low-income communities, but also because we want to be assessing the right metrics, as Ife said, and reestablish what those metrics should be, given all the inputs that we need to be assessing that have sort of really surfaced around mental health, for example. So I think the window is open, and I think that what you're seeing is a lot of openness to the different ways we can be adapting measurement so that it more closely aligns with what is most important for students and families.
Yeah, we have not sure it's so much a question as a thought from a registrant, Valerie Haynes, who says it's important that folks know that the pandemic affected students on so many levels and all those needs need to be addressed. Amanda, this may go to your preference of what you call the whole child. Can you explain that?
Sure, and I think Secretary Cardona alluded to it or spoke to it in his comments at the beginning of the call. So what we are experiencing right now relative to the impact of the pandemic, but I think even as he said, way before the pandemic, is we have to look at our students in a more holistic way in terms of preparing them for the future. And what that means is we have to go beyond academics. We have to look at the impact of the pandemic on social emotional learning and spend a lot more time on mental health access and support, in particular for Latino and African American students and low-income students who were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. As you all know, our communities of color saw many more deaths in their communities, the trauma of lost lives, of lost income, of lost learning. These are all really important issues that we need to take into account when kids return to school buildings. And that needs to be a top priority for our education system, in addition to academics. I would also say physical movement really is part of this as well. So when you think about whole child, this is what I'm talking about. And the last thing I'll just say is there's a real opportunity for more collaboration with community partners. I think it's really difficult to put all of the onus on the education system to serve the multiple needs of all students. And so what I think we've seen is a lot of really positive examples of how community-based organizations who are closer to the communities, know families, know students, are the ones that are providing critical services and supports that encompass what the whole child and whole families actually need. So I would really like to see a shift toward stronger collaboration with community partners in order to support the whole child.
Amanda, for the reporters on this call, can you name a couple of these community-based organizations that have been stepping up so they can follow up in their own communities?
Absolutely. So I live in Boston, and I was actually part of a collaborative called the Community Learning Collaborative. It was a collaborative of the YMCA of Boston, an organization called Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción that focuses on serving the Puerto Rican community in the south end of Boston, and Robert Lewis of The Base, which is a sports-focused nonprofit. They're all entrenched in the community. And so the four of us as leaders of our organizations, myself leading Latinos for Education, we put together a learning community pod. We brought children into our organizations. We supported them with 3 meals a day. We provided enrichment. We ensured that they had access to their learning needs, that they had devices, that they had technology access, that we provided social emotional supports. This was a true example of community coming together of saying we can fill a void, we can step in, we are culturally competent, we know our kids and families. And what we're seeing is a tremendous amount of success with what those learning pods provided to students that we were able to launch around September and October and through the rest of the school year. So these pods exist, the Boys and Girls Club of America, YMCA of Boston. These are all organizations, and those two that are national are doing this, are stepping in to support their communities and supporting children. So those would be some organizations I would point to.
And Ife, you saw students' social and emotional health up close during the last academic year. Share what you've seen.
So yes, I've seen, I just want to first just kind of speak to what Amanda just talked about, because the teaching to the whole child is a need that has always been a need, and the fact that that's not what we see in traditional classrooms and in traditional schools. We have seen that, I've already seen that those social emotional learning needs being deficits. Okay, but now that we have the pandemic, it's exacerbated even more. And so I've seen children, depression is like a very common theme. Depression and anxiety are some of the top themes that I've witnessed as a teacher. As I mentioned before, we did at the beginning of last school year a time capsule project to kind of encapsulate this moment in time in history, because it's just historic for all of us. And one of the activities that students completed was a quarantines video, and it was teenager, just a little play on words. But unfortunately, we found that students were, when they shared their videos, that they were highly stressed, highly depressed, and unmotivated due to several factors, starting with being overwhelmed with the amount of work that they were being given. Teachers, this was all for everyone. And so teachers were just kind of almost mimicking the regular school day and the regular expectations. And, it was too much for children because, oftentimes it's too much anyway for children, the way in which it's set up. And now children were afraid for their lives. They were not able to socialize in the way that they used to, even though they have social media. It's not the same as that in-person interaction. For some students, they live in toxic home environments. And so school used to be that getaway for them. And once everyone quarantined, they didn't have that anymore. And so some students have been in these toxic home environments for almost a year and a half at this point. And then for others, we have children who are just students who are responsible for younger siblings, as I mentioned earlier, and trying to play the role of a parent and a teacher while being a student. It's just the level of stress is just at an all-time high for our babies. And so even in an E4E survey that was recently conducted, they found that more than 8 in 10 teachers claim that their students and families are concerned about social and emotional health. So this is a broad problem. This is a national problem, and honestly, probably a global problem, but definitely national. And so for me, I plan to lean into the beginning of this school year with social, emotional, academic learning activities, where reading, writing, speaking, and listening standards, because I'm an English teacher, those standards can be used to help students reflect on their feelings and learn ways to manage their emotions. We can't act like these things don't exist. And we also can't depend on just guidance counselors and social workers to carry the burden of dealing with it. We all need to take a hand. And I absolutely agree with Amanda that it does take a village to raise a child. And so we do need to bring in community more. We have community partners across the nation that are ready, willing, and able to interact with students. And I think that this is a great opportunity for us to implement more community-based learning in which students are actually collaborating with community partners, not only to deal with their social emotional whatever social and emotional needs they have, but just their academic and learning needs. There are people out here who are actually using the skills that they're learning about. And I think that if we can actually start to bring the community in more, that is a way that we can also start to see some of the social emotional needs being met.
Here we have a comment from Jim Grimes. WQNA of Springfield, Illinois. He says, I'm concerned about using and reporting results of standardized tests to gauge student progress and how schools and staff are evaluated. Is there a better way? I'm curious about the thoughts of all the panelists on those standardized testing.
There was a lot of pushback against the idea of using standardized testing because there were a lot of people who felt like, you know, we shouldn't be focused on issues of so-called learning loss. We really need to be focused on keeping kids emotionally and literally physically safe. That it's a pandemic we're gonna have, like, that's just the way it is. If you survive it, then that's a victory. So why are we worried about exactly what your reading score is? So that point of view is, he's certainly not the only person who holds that. And as others have said here, the idea that we really need to focus on social emotional health and not just academics. You know, that said, there are, I don't think standardized tests are going away. Secretary Cardona alluded to that when he was with us earlier. He said, you know, it was a controversial decision to continue to require states to administer tests, which the Department of Education did, to the consternation of some of President Biden's allies. But they made the decision that this is, you know, we need to know what the situation is in order to address whatever the academic needs may be. So you may not like them, but I don't think they're going anywhere.
Amanda and Ife?
I'll just add that, and I did mention it a little earlier, I do think that you are seeing an increase in interest in more flexible assessment. I think the status quo of standardized assessment is being questioned, and there is a lot of movement around this idea of how do we expand assessment and make it look different. How do we assess the right things? And assess them at the right time. So I do think that there is that growing movement and more flexibility in assessment. And I think that's something to watch.
And I definitely agree, Amanda. One of the organizations that I'm a part of is fairtest.org, and that's their goal, is to look at alternative ways to assess students and to move away from standardized testing, which really it's not necessarily focused enough on bringing students into the 21st century. I mean, we're here, but the standardized tests are not, you know, they're not necessarily preparing students or assessing students in the skills that actually matter for the future. Things like creativity and, you know, problem solving, those are not, and I don't mean like creativity with writing and problem solving with math, but I mean on grander levels. These are the things that we need to be preparing students for. These are the things that we need to assess them for, because if they can show proficiency in 21st century skills, then the likelihood of them being able to be ready for adulthood increases. Also, I forgot what I was going to say, but yes, I do think that we need to look. This is just a great time for us to look at alternatives to standardized education and to not just continue business as usual, because business as usual honestly just wasn't working for masses of children. A very small percentage it's perfect for, but for the masses, and particularly Black and Brown students, students with special needs, students of a lower socioeconomic status, or just varying ability levels, the data shows that these tests are not working and they're stressful. We're talking about addressing the needs of the whole child. These tests aren't doing it. I think that we should look at things like performance-based assessments, project-based learning, and things like that, where we can still focus on standards that matter, but find alternative ways besides just an old-fashioned paper and pencil test to assess students' readiness levels.
Yeah, Amanda, you say schools shouldn't return to normal at all. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'd been hearing this term of we're at risk of running back to normal in education because it's the most comfortable place to go to, especially after what our students' families and our entire education system has gone through and continues to go through. But what I mean is really just to piggyback off of Ife on some of her comments about reimagining education and even comments from the secretary. Again, before the pandemic, what we were providing to low-income students in our educational system was woefully insufficient. And so we cannot run back to the ways in which we were educating children from before because opportunity gaps were not closing. And that's been throughout history. So what does it mean to reimagine or not run back to normal? It doesn't mean changing everything all at once. It means the evolution of change in our education system, starting with some proven areas where we've seen some really positive success, such as early college programming. This is really one area that has been invested in allowing, in particular, low-income children to access a college experience while they're in high school. They're able to complete college courses, get college credits, and enter their undergraduate programs, having a lot less debt and an opportunity to have already received credits. So that's just one area where there's sort of low-hanging fruit, proven success. There needs to be, on the other end of the spectrum, significant more investment in early childhood programming, early childhood education. We know that students often start their educational experience, low-income students, as late as kindergarten. And so they're already at a learning deficit when it comes to their more wealthy peers who get to participate in pre-K type programs. So I think that is really important. The last couple of places is a real focus on culturally competent teaching and education. And what that means is we need more students to have access to curriculum that shares their histories, that acknowledges their histories and experiences, regardless of where they come from and what their status is. So this is another area that, while has been labeled with controversial terms, it really is about affirming all of our students and their families and their histories. Lastly, I'll just double down on closing the digital divide. That's imperative. And I really hope to see those federal dollars to build up the technology infrastructure that's needed for all children and families to access technology for learning, as well as other basic needs that our families need access to.
We've been focused mostly on the children and the students, but let's talk about teachers for a minute. Ife, describe what's going on with teachers during the pandemic.
Well, as we all probably know, teacher burnout has always been a thing. Like, you know, we look forward to that end of the year because summer is our time to reset. But with this pandemic, we haven't even had an opportunity to reset because we've been just stressed all for this past 18 months, whether it's because of our own health concerns. For example, in my school, just within my English department, when the quarantine first began, there were about 5 teachers who were dealing with COVID in their homes. And this was like just at the very first, this was still in March. And unfortunately, one of my colleagues in the building, a teacher in the building, passed away after catching the virus. And so just that alone, dealing with the stress of trying to survive and stay well, but couple that with the expectation that teachers should still just continue to have these high expectations for students, despite the fact that they were highly stressed and depressed, it added more stress to us, you know, and so we're still dealing with that. And even in the recent E4E survey, that same survey, 9 out of 10 teachers expressed concerns about their social, emotional, and mental health, let alone their physical health. And so, you know, we definitely need to see more focus also on teachers because as expected, the top priority was students, but we need as educators to be prioritized too. So it would be great. And I saw in the comments, Adrian Thomas mentioned something about social emotional services or mental health services for not only students in the building, but also teachers and for families. Okay, but for specifically for teachers, you know, for this topic, it would be great for us to know that there's someone that we can turn to during the day. As we're back in these buildings. Also, we need support, like even the smaller class sizes can bring peace of mind, not only for social distancing purposes, but also just for the managing a classroom. So the need is there, the burnout is there, and I just hope that we continue to see teacher, you know, emotions, mental health, teacher health being a hot topic and a topic that's put at the forefront.
And Ife mentioned a Educators for Excellence survey of teachers, and we'll post that after the webinar is finished in resources from this program. Amanda, I know you also have some thoughts about educators, specifically of color.
Yes, thank you. So last year, Latinos for Education, my organization, we did a survey of Latino educators. We were concerned with the impact of COVID on educators, of course, as well as students. But what we found was a disproportionate number of Latino teachers who were also sort of breadwinners for their families, for their extended families. They had suffered trauma, they had suffered job loss in their families, and there was a deep concern with the financial situation amongst our Latino educators. I don't think that that's spoken about very often, and I think important to note that educators of color typically come into the workforce with the idea that they're the first in their families to have graduated from college, for example. And so they become a source for support and income across extended families. So that financial stress was something that was really evident amongst our educators. Of course, mental health, sort of lack of connection, given that Black and Latino educators across the country still remain a very small percentage of representation across our schools. It's really important to point out that educators of color in our schools very often don't have the connections, the networks, and the support systems that they need. And so I want to point that out, because while that is the case, these are also the educators who are also best positioned to connect with their families, with their students and their community in meaningful ways, and that are a top priority of students and families. If you ask students and families, what do they think is important in education, very often they cite how important and valuable it is to have teachers and administrators in the building who share the backgrounds of students and families. So we think Latino teachers, for example, are best positioned to rebuild trust, to regain the confidence of families, to go back to buildings, to make sure that families know that they're supported and safe, that children feel safe. And so these are critical issues that we have to address, in addition to the impact of COVID on families and students, but there is the impact of COVID on educators. We should be concerned about attrition, about educators leaving the workforce, when already Latino and Black educators leave the teaching profession at higher rates and more quickly than their white counterparts in education. So this emphasis on educator diversity is really important and should be part and parcel to how we think about reimagining education and what's important for the future well-being of students and families, given that, for example, in short order, 1 in 4 of our students in our school systems will be Latino. So I'll end with that and just say that I hope that we continue to see more support for educators of color to enter the profession and stay in the profession.
And a final question for Laura. Do you have tips for your fellow journalists on how to track the money from the American Rescue Plan?
Well, I think that, as was said earlier by somebody, I think the secretary, the districts had a lot of flexibility about what they can do. You can look at your state plans that have been submitted to the Department of Education, see what they're planning to do with that money. But I think that if you're covering a local district, the most important thing is to get a little deeper and go into your specific district. Those are all public records that you can get in terms of exactly how they're spending those funds. So I would say that it's a very local thing, I much more than it is a national thing in terms of trying to find it, because there really were so few strings attached.
Well, our thanks again to Amanda Fernandez, CEO and founder of Latinos for Education, Ife Damon, a special education and multi-subject teacher in New York City, Laura Meckler, Washington Post education reporter, and Education Secretary Miguel Cardona.